Okay, we're starting the virtual machine up, going through grub, and booting Ubuntu 6, which was live around 2006. Once it's done, we'll get the Ubuntu login screen. I'll quickly log in, and we'll see SCWM, the Scheme Constraints Window Manager, starting up with a spinny startup logo, and then everything settles in. Let me get a couple of windows up so that we can do so that we can see what's going on. I'll start 2 Firefox instances and a second, and from here Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta Foxtrot. We'll skip Echo so it's not confusing. I. Okay, a bunch of windows. We'll pretend those X loads are on other machines, for example. And now I want to turn on the constraint solver. Why don't we get one more X term? I'm going to get these out of the way. You can see I'm grabbing windows around pretty easily using a bunch of key modifiers and just grabbing the window in the middle. I can resize and stuff like that as well. But let me go ahead and start the constraint solver. And this just starts this toolbar. And as a simple example of a constraint, I'm going to make these 2 Firefox windows sort of behave together. I'm going to connect the right side of this one to the left side of this one. You see it animates to establish a constraint, and now I move things around and they move together. I will make the tops move together as well, constraining the top of the one window to the top of the other window. I'm going to do the same with the bottoms, and then I'm also going to make them be the same width. So for that, I'm going to do it a little bit differently just for kicks. I'm going to control hyperclick on each of these so that these set of windows is selected, and then I'm going to use the relative width constraint that will apply to the 2 selected windows, and now these 2 windows will resize together. They move together, and if one gets smaller, the other gets smaller. If one gets bigger, the other gets bigger. It doesn't matter which one, so forth. Pretty cool. Now let's record a macro, and for this I'm going to make Alpha and Bravo, these 2 windows, I'm going to make move together, and I'm going to use that macro to establish an invariance on all of them. So we'll start recording, then we will make the bottom of this one align with the top of that one. Then we will make the sides align. Then we'll make the other sides align. Then we'll make the bottoms align. And now you can see as I move things around, they move sort of together. Let's make their heights be the same so that they resize together, right? And now let's save that macro as stack vertically. And now you can see the quaint audio cassette tape to indicate a recorded macro. And then I'll use that to put Charlie and Bravo. I meant to say Bravo, but it looks like I spelled it wrong. Oops. And then we'll do that with Delta and Charlie, and then we'll do that with Foxtrot and Delta. And you see each time they animate, and when I resize one, they all resize. Now, as you can see, a couple of them are different size. Alpha is 100 high. Brave is 110. So what I want to do is disable a couple of the constraints and get them all to be the same size. So I'll turn on the constraint investigator. As I put my cursor, my mouse over one of the constraints, it's showing in red the windows that it applies to and showing a visual indication of what the set of constraints are written over top of the windows using XOR, because this is back in the good old days. You can see a couple of these. We'll set an anchor constraint on the top right corner. And now, if I try to resize smaller, it stops resizing at that spot. It won't go any smaller than that. Now, these windows, of course, are still constrained, as I mentioned. You know, as I hover over this, you can see here's the horizontal alignment of the bottoms, here's the horizontal alignment of the tops, here's the vertical alignment of the right and the left, and so forth. If I want to, I can make these bunches of windows interact together. So I could keep this set of windows to the left of this set of windows. Note that as I resize these, or even try to move these windows, if I just try to move it, it actually ends up being resizing because the top right is anchored in the top right. Let's see. So I'm going to use a relative position constraint. We'll keep this window to the left of this window. So now as I try to move this, it resizes the two Firefox windows. Let me get that out of the way. Resizes the two Firefox windows to make sure that it maintains a constraint. If I try to resize the windows instead, that's a stronger constraint, so it resizes the Xload windows until, of course, I hit the minimum size, at which point the Xload windows can't resize anymore, and that constraint takes over, and I can't make the Firefoxes any bigger. You'll notice when I release, it does make them bigger, but it won't move the window further to the right, even though I'm dragging the right side of the window. So that's pretty cool. Another sort of common constraint that I used a lot is kind of tiling two X terms together. Let's make these X terms be the full width of the side. Right now they're unrelated to each other, but I can pretty quickly, let me get this out of the way. Oops. I can pretty quickly add a handful of constraints on these. So let's see, there's a million ways to do it. I can constrain the bottom of this one to the top of that. Then I'll constrain the lefts. It's a pretty common set of constraints. If this one were wider, say, I'll constrain their right sides. And now, as I move them around, you see they move sort of together. But the remaining one that I'm going to do, the remaining constraint I'm going to add after I get these in the corner is I am going to make their sum of heights a constant. So this window plus this window's y heights are forced to be constant. So now, if I try to move the windows, they still move together, but if I try to resize this bottom one, the top one gets bigger or smaller, and vice versa. So if I make this bigger, the bottom one gets smaller. And most appropriately, you would probably choose to move them via the middle, and resizing either one does the right thing, right? And the two X terms end up being sort of tiled along this left half of the screen, or however much of the screen I want, because they also move that way together. Now if I wanted to, I could anchor the top up here. Now the top, no matter what I do, the top is going to stay along the top of the screen. I can't drag it down, I can't drag it up. It's going to stay right there. And I could anchor along the left edge if I wanted to too. So we'll anchor that along the left edge. So now if I were to drag out, I can drag the edge, I can drag this edge, but otherwise it's sort of It doesn't appear to be anchored there anymore. Let me try that anchor again. Right there. Okay, now they're sort of anchored along that edge. Yeah, there we go. That anchor isn't quite where I want it to be. So I can disable that anchor, move it, and then re-enable that anchor. And now it's kind of more where I wanted it to be. I can resize that edge, I can resize in between, and so forth. So that's a pretty good overview of all the different stuff that you can do. I mean, these things, if I wanted to keep these windows, to the left of these windows, I could do that too, using the relative position, window on the left, window on the right. There we go. And see how, as I push these windows, it resizes. Right now I have it in a mode. There's also a separate mode. I have it in springy constraints mode. If I turn off springy constraints mode, then while I'm dragging this window, it sort of pushes the window out of the way and it doesn't spring back to where it was at the start of the interaction. Slightly different behavior. I never really could decide which I liked better. I thought that there were scenarios where one works better and scenarios where the other works better. But you can see as I drag things around, all the behaviors that happen, managing all the different constraints that I've been using. If I turn springy constraints back on, here we go. And you see the little nuance in the menu. It explains that springy constraints really have to do with the way that I manage state constraints in the underlying Cassowary constraint solver. But you can see now it's behaving springy again. And as I move these things around, the other windows that are impacted kind of spring back to their starting position until the gesture is done. Kind of fun to watch. And again, if you want to, you can inspect all the different constraints using this constraint inspector down here. And you can record more macros. You'll note that the constraint investigator, did some light animation to make sure that certain of the constraints were represented in a couple different ways. But it only animates when you're hovering over the investigator, otherwise it would be pretty annoying. But this is a full set of constraints: a sum of heights constraint, sum of widths constraint, horizontal separation, keeping one window to the left of the other or keeping one window above the other, a max height constraint, a max width constraint, a min height constraint, min width constraint, relative height, relative width, vertical alignment, horizontal alignment, strict relative position, which means moving windows around together, and anchoring. I guess one that I didn't really show was strict relative position. Let me pull up another, I don't know, let's pull up a xcalc instance. And let's say that I always want them to be sort of offset in exactly this way. We'll try strict relative position. I'll do the center of this window with the top left of this window. So now, so now they're just moving together. As the center of this window moves, you can see that the other window is moving only half as much as I resize because it's tuned to the center of this window, not the edge. I could have done the edges too if I want to disable this. You can see strict relative, the center of one to the left edge of the other. Let me disable that one and do strict relative, the bottom right of this one with the top left. So now you can see that they're related in that way. So as I move the bottom right and resize that, they behave a little bit differently and so forth. Anyway, you get the idea. All of this is happening using code written in Scheme. And if I pull up, some other examples. Let's, I don't know, try the clock example. So if I start an xclock instance, one of the things that was always a little weird about this is you could resize the thing so it wasn't circular. So it wasn't bounded in a square. And that's a little weird. So if we want to, we can define the new constraint to keep a constant aspect ratio. Here's the definition of the function that does that. And if I define that function, we'll talk about how that works later, I can then use it. It's prompting me to keep constant aspect ratio on which window. So I pick this window. And now if I try to resize this window, you see that I'm stuck resizing it at a constant aspect ratio because that constraint is kicked in. Pretty neat. Another thing that's different with Linux is windows aren't constrained to stay on screen. If I try to drag up using the title bar, obviously I get to the top of the screen and can't move further. But I can, using keyboard modifiers, I can drag up from anywhere and can move the window pretty far off the side of the screen. If I didn't want that, I could define a constraint that keeps a window on top of on the screen. So we'll do that to my Emacs window here. I'll define that function, and then I will tell it to run on this window, and you see it moved it so it stays on screen. But now as I try to move it off screen, it is preventing me from moving it off screen. Sometimes it's forcing a resize, sometimes it's just not letting me move further. I can choose to resize the window if I want to, but no matter what I do, even if I'm dragging this window around and trying to move it off screen to the right, instead of letting it go off screen, it's resizing it. See? Or I can try resizing, and if I try to resize and it goes off screen, oops, I grabbed the wrong one. If I try resizing and it goes off screen, it won't let me make it wider than the screen either. Very good. That's all for now. Just show you a little bit more of this stuff. Let's remove that resize. Oh yeah, I did that here. Okay, it's a pretty good demo. There's a lot more to show. I'm going to do that in another segment. Thanks.